I remember being 4 or 5 and lugging my wagon behind me. And in that wagon were pieces of paper and pencils. And I see the scene of being asked, I don't know by whom, "What are you doing?" And my answer was, "I'm going to work." "You're going to work? What do you do at work?" "I'm going to a meeting." And day by day, I would lug my wagon and go to meetings. And that's what I thought work was. Over time, I started to see the paper that was in my wagon as something called leaflets. I don't know that I knew what a leaflet was, but I knew that my dad was always going to early morning meetings to pass out leaflets. I now understand that what he was doing was either standing on a picket line, giving out leaflets to people to urge them not to cross the picket line, or he was at a factory gate urging people to join the union and giving out leaflets. But as a 4 and a 5-year-old, when I think about work, I remember playing at work. It took me a couple of decades to get back to that kind of work. I don't remember the weight of the world being on my shoulders. I remember firmly believing that the world was screwed up, but it would get better in my lifetime. I firmly believed that destiny was an improvement in the social issues of the time, that equity and fairness would become the staples of the day, and that somehow I'd be involved with that. I think it matters for for me and for current generations and further generations to understand that we were, in fact, an immigrant family and that we were transformed by the process of immigration and that we became who we are and who we will become in large measure as a result of where we have come from. It begins, in terms of what I know, with 2 families in a small town in the midst of the Russian Ukraine. The town, Bershad, exists still about halfway between Kiev and Odessa in the midst of the Ukraine. There were 2 families, the Simonoviches and the Melmans. And those are our ancestors. Here we have that family, the Simon family, as they existed soon after they arrived in Toronto. My grandparents, the carpenter and his wife Rachel, were the parents of my dad and his 2 brothers, Bill and Mac, and my dad was the first of them to marry. That's my mom, and my older brother, Moish. The brothers eventually married, and eventually I was born, and there were a slew of cousins who now make up the what's left of the Simon family. The family left behind in Bershad what was described to us as a thriving steam bath business. The Yiddish word is bud, bath, and they were the bud masters of Bershad. And the patriarch of the family, his name is Moshe Leib. The mythology has it that he learned his trade because he had to cut the trees and then cut the logs and then trim the logs and get them to the steam bath because that was the only way to heat the water which came from the river. So the river was pumped, the water from the river was pumped to the steam bath and heated by the logs that his son, probably both sons, were made to harvest. This then is the other founding family, my family, the Millmans. And this is my great-grandfather, Nuchem Laser, where I get my name, Norman Leon. He didn't come to the New World, but the rest of the family did. My grandfather Alec and his wife Sarah, that's my mom. But I heard my grandfather, my Zeta Alec, talk about the fear and the fear in the distance. And there were, in fact, massive pogroms at the time that the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War caused massive disruption in the lives of Jews in the community, massive deaths, expropriation of property, levying of massive taxes. And so there was, among all Jews, a constant fear. My grandfather, his wife, and the three girls traveled through Europe, went through Romania, eventually to London, and came to Toronto, arriving in about 1912. My mom, in her memories about the trip, always pointed out that she was watched over very carefully, because what she described as all of the family riches, all of the family cash, was sewn into her coat. And then my mom also talked about how horrible the trip was, that they were basically in a ship without comfort, that it was a mammoth bottom of the ship with no privacy, with very little place to sleep, and that the food was limited, and that she remembered being fed only oranges, and to her last day refused to ever eat an orange. The Simonoviches started out in Bershad and had several false starts, leaving Bershad and traveling to Romania. And there was my dad, Harry, his middle brother, Bill, and a younger brother, Mac. And the three of them traveled with their parents, eventually through London and on to Toronto.
To get out of Russia, we went on a horse and wagon to get out, to go to the border. My mother, father, and my two brothers and myself, 5 of us. The first night we started out, the wagon broke down, the axle, the wheels came off, so we had to return. The second night, we finally got to the border. It wasn't clear to get across to the other side, so we had to turn around. So you can imagine my mother crying. And then finally, the third night, we finally managed to get across the river. But when we got across to the Romanian side, we had to start going over farm fences to get to the destination we were supposed to meet with, the people who were supposed to meet us, to hide us. So we finally got to, with a guide, to the place, and we managed to stay in called Bessarabia at that time. After about 6 months in Chisinau, we finally got to big city, Galați in Romania, and we stood there close to 3 years. It was finally time to move on. My father wanted to go to Palestine. My mother wanted to go to Canada because she had cousins here. We managed to get here and went for 1923.
As was the case in all immigrant groups, what you did when you landed in a town was that you found your fellows. You found if you were Italian, they were paisanes, and if they were Jewish, they were Landsmen. And the Simons found their Landsmen, the Mellmans, and the families became friends. Simon and Mr. Millman is how they respectfully referred to each other, even though they shared this magnificent journey out of Russia into Canada in a new life. My grandfather, Zaid Alec, in fact, took up work almost right away as one of Toronto's very first bagel bakers, and worked at a bakery in Kensington Market, at the Russian Bagel Bakery. My grandfather, my Zayda Shloima, my Sam, continued his trade as a carpenter, as a cabinet maker, and became involved in most of his work became involved in building cutting tables for the needle trades industries up and down Spadina, which were beginning to flourish in the 1920s. And my grandfather found a living making the cutting tables for those industries, just as the Millman family, entirely, except for Zaid Alec, who was the baker, but the girls all worked in the needle trades industries. They had a brother born in Canada, the first of that generation, my Uncle Normie, and he too worked in the clothing industry, in sales. So universally, all of the offsprings were somehow involved in the needle trades. My dad and my mom eventually found each other as lovers and married. Why does it make me so sad or proud or I don't know what, but I guess it's the cornerstone of the family that is now mine. And these two kids at 20, they were only 20, married. I tell the story. I believe it's true, but I just believe it's true because I've told it all my life, is that if they had stayed in the village, they would have married because they would have been the only kids of the right age to find each other. But nonetheless, they found each other in Toronto and managed to live a 65-year marriage. I recall my dad talking about leading the major demonstration against Nazism as being 24. And he talks about the weight of the world being on his shoulders.
One of the organizers of the demonstration was Harry Simon.
You were a very young man when this all took place. How old were you?
Well, I was only 24 in 1933. But in those days, you carried the world on your shoulders when you were 24.
To have an understanding for Jewish life and a sense of meaning in it. Our teachings of social justice and righteousness and freedom for all mankind must continue in a world torn apart with greed, hatred, and injustice.
The kids, like not my grandparents, but my parents' level, that the spotlight was most on my dad, that he, even when he went to, after schooling, went to work as an apprentice in a fur shop, immediately continued to be active in the Fur Workers Union, and he was active in local organizations that were fighting anti-Semitism. Remember that Hitler came to power in 1933. They were in Toronto in 1924, so it was only a decade of more latent anti-Semitism. By 1933, Nazism had become the terror that it was going to be in Germany. And as sad as the reality is, that you don't want to hear as a proud Canadian and as a proud Torontonian, there were swastika boys all around Toronto in 1933 who felt that they had an obligation to do parades of swastika flags around the city, primarily, and I've never found out why, primarily in the beaches and around Christie Pitts. There were swastika parades. And it symbolized a kind of a latent anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. That the orange was the order, and others were deviants. It showed in all kinds of laws and quotas and barriers that existed for the Jews and Catholics in Toronto. My dad, at that point, was working for the furriers. It was agreed with his colleagues to organize what turned out to be the very first anti-fascist demonstration in North America. And in July of 1933, there was a massive demonstration, mostly of, although it was characterized as a community thing, but mostly of needle trade workers from Spadina Avenue, gathering at Clarence Square, a park at the foot of Spadina, marching up to Queen's Park to demonstrate against fascism in Germany. My dad often got credit as the leader of that. He wasn't the sole leader. There were many, but he was proud of having done that. It turned out that a month later, there was this riot at Christie Pitts. And the Christie Pitts riot came about as a result of, during a game, the swastika boys felt compelled to race around with their flags. And the players of one particular team happened to be made up of Jewish boys, and they decided to attack the swastika boys. And that led to a fight that grew and grew and grew. The mythology of the fight is that the two communities from the entire city started trucking in gangs of boys who fought with each other. And that became known as the Christie Pitts riot. It's become an important part of what I care about because for me, it so represents my dad and his family of that time. Not only was my dad involved in organizing the demonstration a month before, one of my uncles, one of his brothers, played in the baseball game that led to the riot.
We were playing against the church team, St. Peter's, and right near the end of the game, there were some Nazi flags unfurled, and they started some small fight, and they promised to be back the next game, which we played at Christie Pitts. That night, right after the game, they started fighting, and it was a real riot, which lasted until after midnight. They had trucks there to take us away back to college in Brunswick, so they hustled it onto the truck. But I had some bats in my hand, which disappeared to some people that I knew, and I think they put it to good use.
His kids, my cousins, proudly tell the story that their dad knew he couldn't effectively fight, so he gave his bat to Sammy Lovestring, who was a well-known boxer at the time, so he could fight against the swastika boys. Both the demonstration and the riot have become, for me, a romanticized version of the fight of the time and my dad's involvement of the time. I want to tell you about my mom. She was a mom of her time, but at the top of the list. She was warm and caring and giving, dedicated and supportive of her husband and of her kids, and spent a lot of her time in sister organizations with similar aims and goals as my dad. And so she was part of charities, she was part of organizations that understood the need to protect people's dignity.
We would try to do away with and forget about all our religious traditions, customs, and ways which kept our people alive for centuries and have brought so much beauty into Jewish life. But what the sons run away from, the grandsons want to go back to.
It's an important part of understanding the whole family, my dad and my brother's relationship to Judaism. It wasn't at all synagogue-based. It had no religious dogma attached to it. It was entirely cultural. It was a sense of being, it was a sense of who we are, it was a sense of tradition. It was a sense of togetherness that we felt, not a sense of any loyalty to a super being or to the magic of religion. But on the other hand, I love having the family around me on Passover. I love the idea of, for its ritualistic nature, of having the youngest person at the Passover dinner ask the 4 questions and hide the matzah and other rituals like that give me a warmth and a sense of connection to the past. When you think about Judaism in the 40s and 50s, there was very little Reform Judaism, but also at that time, maybe regrettably, it's another story, Zionism got entwined with Judaism. And the whole notion of the importance of the creation of the so-called Jewish state became part of the celebration of the religion. On that front, my dad and our family could be called very serious Jews, because we were very committed to the notion of the creation of Israel. And it's frankly hard for younger people to understand that was not a pejorative, that the term Zionism was not a pejorative at the time, that it was seen as a super progressive, necessary forward step. And I remember the UN vote that created Israel. I remember my dad and others sitting around a radio listening to the vote happen. So being Jewish in the post-war was still a little bit tough on the anti-Semitism side. There still was an undercurrent of them and us, and people felt a little bit insecure, exacerbated somewhat by the return bigotry on the part of some of the Jewish community. They weren't entirely innocent on that front. But it was also entwined with this excitement, like real excitement about the building of Israel. And the example of that in the family terms was that my brother packed up his high school and prepared to become an Israeli, and gave up a good student path to learn a trade, which happened to be the trade of his grandfather, carpentry, so that he could practice it in building Israel. And he went with his best chum at the time and settled on a Sinai border, a kibbutz, and lived on a kibbutz, a collective farm, for 18 months. My brother Moish, eventually came home because being there didn't sit all that well with him. But still, it was an important part of his commitment. And I remember, even though I was, 8 or 9 when he went, 9 or 10, when he went to Israel, I remember the tension of my parents, who on the one hand couldn't be prouder of their son going off to be a builder of the state. And on the other hand, their son going off to live in a precarious, war-torn environment. The whole notion of my father remembering and talking proudly of his bar mitzvah in Romania has a significance in that my brother didn't have a bar mitzvah. By then, my dad had become so much of a committed socialist that the notion of any devotion to a hardcore religion was an impossibility. But 13 years later, in 56, when it was time for me to have my bar mitzvah, I did have one.
I want to thank my parents for giving me the privilege of being master of ceremony tonight with my brother's bar mitzvah. It is indeed an honor. I am sure that we shall all be as proud of him in the future as we are proud of him tonight.
I may say that I've been a dreamer all my life, always dreaming of greater horizons for my fellow men. And I hope that all my life I shall continue to dream of a better world where all men shall be free and independent, including our own Jewish people.
Part of his existence, and therefore mine, was protecting the right to be whatever kind of a Jew you wanted to be, was so diehard in him. In the late 40s and early 50s, post-war, he was very, very active in something called the Jewish Labor Committee for Human Rights. And it existed in order to protect people's right to be who they were and to go on celebrating their religion and their culture in any way they wanted. And much to his credit and to that organization's credit, they, in the late 50s, took on the fight for access to rental accommodation for blacks in Toronto. It was very tough to form a union, that the laws that protected workers against the interference or the outright, more than interference, demolition of unionization were very strong. I remember my dad getting up a lot of mornings, very, very early, to go out and stand at plant gates to pass out leaflets to tell workers how to form a union and to encourage them to sign up. So from the get-go, it was very, very tough for workers to express their united strength. The whole notion of any involvement over what we now take so entirely for granted about health and safety was alien. Those were management's rights. And the law at the time said that anything that management didn't give up, anything that wasn't named in legislation or that management didn't voluntarily give up, was by nature management's right. The laws that were not really necessarily worker laws, that worked against workers. For example, this uncle, other side of his family, aunt, the other side of her family, died in a industrial fire because they were required by insurance laws to lock the doors, and the locked doors forced them to not be able to cope with a fire. They died in the blaze because the doors were locked. But if the doors weren't locked, they wouldn't have insurance. So again, it was this whole notion of safety was none of your business. Just go to work. My dad was the only dissenting vote on the first commission on Medicare in Ontario, where everybody else voted no and he voted yes. Then a commission set up by the provincial government. That there were massive campaigns to change the health and safety rules that my dad was involved in. And there was just the run-of-the-mill negotiation where contract by contract, things were made a little bit better.
We shall overcome someday. Oh, dear.
From the time I was dragging my wagon at 4 until my teenage years, I had a whole series of typical jobs, and the whole notion of working was never a question. I genuinely believe that I began to understand the boss-employee relationship, that I began to understand power, and that there wasn't a balance. There wasn't fairness, there wasn't equity. There were bosses and there was everybody else. But also at that time, became involved with my high school sweetheart, with Myrna, and at 16 was her date at her sweet 16. And 5 years later, we were married. So there was a lot of time with AZA, there was a lot of time with Myrna, there's a lot of time with my jobs, and there wasn't a lot of time with school. I was everybody's great Cluck. How could he do so poorly? How come this kid who's so articulate and so busy and so involved in stuff is such a crummy student? And I guess the question was the answer. It's because there was too much energy or so much energy in caring about all those other things. At that time, Ontario was grade 13, and that you wrote universal province-wide exams for grade 13, and that's what determined what would happen to your future education, was the results of those exams. And as was entirely predictable, my marks were atrocious, and instead of the 9 subjects that I needed to have passed to go to university, I managed to scrape through with 5. There's no law school for me with those marks. In fact, there's no university for me with those marks. And the question was, what would I do? Where would I go? I remember the summer of 60. I was working for my brother and my Zeta Schloime, Sam, the carpenter, as a summer job on construction. I shared my agony about what am I going to do with my horrible grade 13 marks with my brother. He said, why don't you go to Ryerson and take a course that will teach you how to read architects' plans and price the work. And you could be the business development arm of Simon Construction, and we could grow the business, and we could bid on all these projects that were flourishing everywhere. But lo and behold, I got the calendar from Ryerson. It was all the stuff I hated, that I was going to go back to school and do more math, and more trigonometry, and more geometry, and more algebra, and all of this stuff that I saw as meaningless as a student. What am I doing? And I leaf through the pages, and there is, I didn't know such a thing existed, a first-year course combining radio and television arts and journalism. But I looked at the subjects that I was to study: political science, history, economics, English galore, propaganda, print management. What? That's what I want to spend my next 3 years doing. I had gone to see my dad in his office on Eglinton Avenue, and somehow I was attracted to a phone booth. And I phoned Scott Young. Scott Young was a very, very popular sports columnist with the Globe and Mail at the time. And I called Scott Young cold and said, "Do I want to be a journalist?" And he asked me a bunch of questions and said, "Of course you want to be a journalist." So I worked even harder on my application for journalism school at Ryerson and got accepted. And lo and behold, 3 years after talking to Scott Young on the phone and deciding to go to journalism, I was something called a journalist. In the final summer, between my second and third year, I responded to a notice on a bulletin board that had been placed by the Prescott Journal. Prescott is a little town on Lake Ontario. It was just after Myrna and I had got engaged, so every weekend was a trip home to Toronto. Come 5:15 on Friday, I was on the road with my thumb out, hitchhiking back to Toronto, stayed the weekend in Toronto, and then took the midnight train out of Toronto back to Prescott, got in at 4 o'clock in the morning, and was at work at the Journal and the Upper Canada Gazette at 9 Monday morning. The work at both the Journal and the Upper Canada Gazette was spectacularly informative for me in ways I had never envisioned. I wrote the stories, I took the photographs, I designed the pages, I learned a bit about the business of selling advertising when it came time to populate the Upper Canada Gazette with ads. The only way those ads would get sold is if I went motel to motel trying to convince people to buy space. And when it finally existed as a newspaper, I delivered them. And in the meantime, I also did basic journalism, covered things that happened. Also spent a lot of time editing the social notes. It was a time long before internet was a dream. Social notes were a big part of weekly papers, and basically they said nothing more than Mrs. Jones is visiting Mrs. Smith this week. And the paper was chock full of those items. Somebody had to translate the telephone calls that led to that information. Somebody had to edit it. Somebody had to set it into type. Somebody had to, by hand, take the pages off the press one by one before they got fed by hand in the folder to turn them into what you thought was the finished newspaper. And I did all of that. The involvement with that mechanical side of the business and understanding what was possible in terms of design and layout and cropping photographs and the use of typefaces was a major, major plus for me for the rest of my career. Art Cole was, for then and for a long time afterward, the city editor at the Telegram, and had been the one who had interviewed me and the others, and had hired others and not me. "Norm, this is Art Cole. I want you to come to work for me. I got a job for you." "Sorry? No, I know we didn't hire you, but I've got something for you. Are you interested?" A pause longer than this pause. And I came that close to saying, "F you." I came this close to saying, "Which of my fellow students is this pulling my leg? Why in the world are you taunting me this way?" I didn't say that. Did I consider not going? Absolutely. But I went. His story was, I've gone through, in the last couple of months, 3 labor reporters, senior journalists who have screwed it up, who have let me down, who haven't done the job. So I figure I might as well hire a kid who I can teach to make my mistakes, his words, rather than bring his own mistakes. My favorite story that I covered was what I regard as the major industrial relations story of the century. And that was, of all things, a strike against the Telegram and the other daily newspapers by the typesetters, the ITU, the International Typesetters Union. And the issue was the typesetters were on strike to win control of the computer. Digital wasn't a word that existed. Nobody knew, even guys covering the strike, what the computer would do, what it would change. The whole notion of digital typesetting and the elimination of the reporter typing on a piece of paper and taking his paper out of a typewriter and saying boy, and boy being copy boy would have to come along and get it and give it to an editor who would, by pencil, edit it and shout boy, and it would go to a copy editor who would edit it for length and write the headlines and the cut lines for the pictures and hold it up again and say boy, and boy would run it downstairs to the composing room where somebody working on a linotype with hot metal would turn it into raised type, and the raised type would then be turned into a plate, and the plate would then be turned into a flat plate, would then be put on the press, and then run off as a newspaper. All of those steps were going to be abolished, basically. And there was little Normie trying to write about this. What I understood would fit in a sentence, let alone the paragraph I just wrote for you. In addition to genuinely covering it, there was all the pressure of course, the Telegram management didn't want the story to be told objectively. It wanted the story to be told from its point of view. And so as a journalist, very, very early on, I faced all of those ethical questions about how much should I let them edit. The strike went on, and the strike went on, and it still technically exists. It was never settled. Those poor guys walked picket lines and eventually retired from a picket line rather than from a job. That was the biggest story I covered. The best piece of journalism that I did was actually around a CUPE strike, a strike of the garbage collectors in the city of Toronto. It had been a big, big, big deal story in Toronto because the garbage wasn't collected. And it was one of the first big garbage strikes. The main issue was a wage question. The way of covering it is that they were on strike for a nickel. They were on strike for a nickel an hour. And through a very clever piece of bargaining, the union had figured out a way to get the nickel without it being called a nickel raise. They increased the retroactive period so that the amount that was given in retroactivity covered the same amount as if they had got the nickel added to the rate. So the strikers got every penny they wanted. So I wrote the story that way. I wrote it as a union victory. The publisher, John Bassett, called me in. And this was a big deal. A little kid reporter doesn't get called in by the publisher. He was there, and the editor-in-chief was there, and looked across the desk at me, said, "Norm, don't you know, no one ever wins or loses a strike. How could you write the story to say that the workers had won the strike?" And I looked out the window of John Bassett's office, and what did I see? But these poor, desperate ITU members, the typographers who were on strike, wandering hopelessly outside the building in a strike that was definitely lost. It confirmed for me that I wasn't wrong about the class struggle, that there really was a struggle and that the struggle needed warriors. And soon after that, I left the Telegram and went to work for CUPE. I'm grateful for my time at the Telegram, for two particular friendships that began there. One was Stephen Lewis, who at the time was not yet leader of the Ontario NDP, but he was the Labour critic. And because I was Labour reporter, I had a great deal of interaction with him, and it became a lifetime friendship. In addition to that, a young reporter at the Telegram, Dick Proctor. Dick and I became chums. He later came to work with me at CUPE, and we overlapped in time working for Ed Broadbent. So I trace that friendship to our times together as rookie reporters at the Telegram. I was 24 when I made the decision to leave the Telegram and to go to CUPE. That I was 24 has added significance to me because I recall my dad talking about leading the major demonstration against Nazism as being 24. Going to CUPE where I could be both involved in issues of social justice and issues around politics enthralled me and excited me. I didn't know what the job was about or what the PR director did. I showed up on day one and I was shown an office and not given chores and not told what to do. And so I took my clue from my dad, and when I was 4 years old, pulling my wagon. First of all, I went to meetings. I didn't know if I had a budget, but I decided to redo the standard leaflets. I didn't particularly like the printed material that existed about CUPE. And so I just started doing that. And I started applying what I had learned at the Prescott Journal, and I redesigned the print material. At the time, there was something of a monthly national newsletter, and I decided my view of what it was could be better. Here, this was a major one, the CUPE story. Just that there was no product like that. I didn't quite know how it would get distributed or what they'd be used for. My instinct told me that it ought to exist, and I had nothing else to do with my time. But then, from going to the meetings and seeing what the activity was, what was going on, it occurred to me that all of those activities had a particular communication function that wasn't being managed. That there were reps in the field negotiating contracts, getting into conflict situations with employers, mostly in a public arena, because they were public employees. So they were city employees or school board employees or hospital employees. So I decided that was my job. That's why they had a PR director. And I developed systems and products that would be helpful to these field reps in the challenges that they faced, and learned that in certain situations it was in fact good to be in on the actual activity, that some news stories were big enough that required somebody to handle the press. And so I started going out to these bargaining situations. And that became my job, to be the communication support to all the other things that CUPE was doing. Every opportunity was an opportunity to express who and what CUPE was and what it stood for. In 1978, CUSO came calling. Canadian University Students Overseas was the Canadian version of the Peace Corps. CUSO mostly placed Canadian teachers in developing countries to be teachers in those countries. And it decided that it wanted to move into placing and apprenticeship teachers into developing countries. And so they had this idea that somebody should follow a bunch of these apprentice teachers and these tradespeople into their activity in West Africa. And they asked me to do it. I interviewed them before they left Canada. And then after they were settled for 6 months, I went to their various locations in Ghana and Nigeria and wound up doing a series of magazine articles about their experiences. So I spent 6 weeks traveling in West Africa. Great fun, wonderful experience, got me out of town. The West Africa trip was actually dreamt up by my good chum, Jerry Kaplan. At that point, he was the head of CUSO in all of West Africa. By then, had become my very, very best friend, as he still is. I look back on that time, on that decision, and what ensued in my dozen years at CUPE as the major foundation of my life. It was particularly meaningful to me in the middle 70s. By then, personally, I was living a very different existence. Rand had been born in 1967, just after we got to Ottawa. Rand was born with a club foot. And so from virtually within hours of his birth, his leg went in a cast. And that cast was part of his life for his first 6 months or so. And every week, that cast needed to be changed so that the foot could gradually be turned to positive. Post-cast, Rand became the wearer of what called Dr. Brown's splints, and he lived for 23 hours a day in shoes, the tiniest little white shoes, joined by a bar. Nonetheless, he learned how to crawl and recovered. It was miraculous, but it required, even as he was post-shoes, for us, him and me, to do nightly exercises of twisting the foot. For sure, it enhanced the bond between us. During all of this time, Myrna began to struggle with her cancer. Her first diagnosis was during Rand's pregnancy, that she began to have lesions on her leg that turned out to be malignant. And so after Rand was born, there was her first series of treatments and radiation, and of all things, injections of radiated gold that got injected into the systems of treatment of the time. There was what was regarded as a major remission. And it was mostly a misdiagnosis, because it turned out to not to be the remission that it was claimed to be. But the diagnosis led to the permission to adopt Alana. So Alana could not be a child we birthed because of the radiation that had injected in her system. Wouldn't have been safe for the baby to have been carried. So we adopted Alana. She was born in July, and we adopted her in September.
I guess the first memory I have is when I was about 3, and he told me that I was getting a sister. And then sort of for the next few years, we had Alana and we had my mom. My mom actually did get sick when I was really little, but I was too young to remember that. But then when she got sick again, when I was about 6, I remember my dad telling me that she was sick, like really sick, and was probably going to die. And I thought this was like a great thing that he just came out and told me. Not that it wasn't sad or anything, but that this is just what was going to happen. And I think that's kind of had a big impact on how I view things and try to talk about things with people, like very open, matter of fact with them, not hide anything if there's something they need to know.
While Myrna was ill, there was tremendous family support. My mom came from time to time. My brother Moish and his wife Joyce, and the two nieces, Tammy and Julie. And in addition to that, spectacular support from wonderful, wonderful friends. Lynn and Teddy Cohen, Melody Morrison, Jerry Kaplan, Dick Proctor, and Myrna's family, in their grief, were also spectacularly considerate and helpful. Towards the end of 74, it was determined to be terminal, and she died in 75. It was tough for my colleagues, friends at work, because I'd be there and I'd be flat, I'd be empty, I'd be nowhere. But then along came the Trudeau wage and price controls in September, and it was actually at a staff meeting that I was boycotting. I just didn't bother going to. I stayed by myself in my office. That I presume that my colleagues had a conversation about the theme of which was, what are we going to do about Norm? And out of nowhere, a bunch of them came upstairs to my office and declared that I was going to be the CUPE coordinator of a national strike day against the wage and price controls. And so that was kind of my comeback. It remains a positive memory for me in terms of what my friends did for me and in pulling me out of there, out of my despair. '75, as it turned out, was the first named year by the United Nations. It was the Year of the Woman. In an attempt to bring my work and my grief together, I did a lot of campaign work around justice for women workers. When I think back on it, the profile that I helped Grace and Shirley achieve, and the work that I did around the Year of the Woman and rights and opportunities for women workers, is some of my greatest sense of accomplishment of that time. My 11 years at CUPE were stunning. They were fascinating from the work that I did. They were fascinating from the point of view of extending what I had learned earlier on. A lot of warmth, friendship, experiences, but none of it mattered as much as it was the place and time to meet Mary Jane.
I was working at Air Canada, and I was part-time at the time, so a friend of mine convinced me to go to work in a travel agency. It happened to service CUPE's account. We were in the same building, 233 Gilmore. And one day I got a call from Norm Simon to book a trip for him, and he was so engaging on the phone. And we started sort of bumping into each other in the cafeteria, and his secretary came to check me out. She was very protective of him. I wasn't really sure of what his circumstances were. I knew he had children, but obviously he worked at CUPE. I got to know a few of the people who work there. I was always obviously making bookings for them as well, and they'd come into the office. And I quickly knew, started to know a bit more of the story, because they had all lived through that horrible tragedy for him and cared a lot about him. He brought Alana in one day to book a trip to Florida. I asked her for her phone number, so I was booking it, and she gave it to me. And he said to me, well, if she can give you her phone number, surely you can give me yours. And then, eventually we did have a first date, and that immediately I felt the warmth towards him. I wouldn't have expected at 23 to have been with somebody who had a family already, but he brought a lot of laughter into my life. My father had died when I was just 19, and I met him 5 years later, so I sort of understood loss in that kind of way that I think probably made me a little bit more mature for my age in terms of family and understanding maybe what the children were going through. I think I was quite sensitive to not imposing myself too much on the kids. I was always very sensitive to the fact that if it didn't work out, I didn't want them to have another kind of loss or in their lives. He was tense about my not being Jewish, and also being probably that much younger. I could see that I was 9 years younger than Norm.
But finally, when I decided that, yes, this was the rest of my life, somehow I found the courage to just face my father and put it to him that we were a package deal and he accepted us all, including the kids, or not at all. Progressively, my dad came around. Bit by bit, he was won over by the warmth. It was impossible to not admire Mary Jane and all she brought to the relationship and the care that she brought to his grandkids. So while there was some resistance in terms of the family embracing Mary Jane on our marriage, that was certainly not the case with our friends. And at the top of the list of cheerleaders, friends then and still and always, were George Addy and Lise Marchand. My favorite thing about my mom was how, in despite of other forces, she was entirely supportive and protective of the relationship between Mary Jane and me.
Loved giggling and was self-deprecating, and she wasn't competitive at all. And I immediately liked her. You could not like her. She was such a warm person.
There really almost wasn't a transition, so to speak. It was very natural. With Mary Jane, everything was so easy. I had known her for so long before they got married as Mary Jane. And even by the time I was 12, I was a pretty practical, logical person that I just kept calling her Mary Jane because I knew her as Mary Jane, and I never didn't not think of her as being my mom.
When he's asked about the whole notion of having had a mother, Myrna, and then a stepmother, Mary Jane, and what it was like and how it felt and what's it like to be a kid moving from a traditional mothering relationship to a second mother relationship. And Rand's response to that was, he had two of the best mothers you could possibly have. He believed in the strength of both of them. So when I think about my marriage to Myrna, and I think about the 5 years after she died that Mary Jane and I got married, what was it like? It was like winning the lottery over and over and over and over again. How could I be so lucky to have such spectacular women to be my partner? I firmly believe that as I am a part of all that I have met, If only I could be more a part of Mary Jane for all her goodness and calm and insight. I started to feel about my Ottawa life, despite the romance with Mary Jane, that it was going around in circles, that what I was doing at CUPE was the same as what I had done. The thought that once you were in that union environment, that it could easily become a forever thing. And it just felt to me like it needed to be changed. There was this Toronto job offered. One of the things that happened there that in fact became very important for the rest of my career was that I had the good sense to say before I accepted the job that I wasn't giving up my point of view, that I promised to never embarrass them with my point of view, and that if my feelings were so strong that I couldn't accept what they were doing as managers, I would quit rather than condemn, but that I kept the right to disagree. My years at City Hall prepared me in a way that I thought I understood when I was going in, having had the experience, the barriers created by bureaucracy and learning how to deal with it in a real life environment. One had to not resist the existence of the bureaucracy. One had to, in fact, accept it, but to find the soft spots in it, to find the needs that individuals or groups of individuals had and respond to those needs rather than to the bureaucratic structure. So the reality that structures and bureaucracies were immovable is true, but not unmanageable. And learning to manage them rather than to resist them was a key learning of the City of Toronto. A mutual friend and colleague at the time, Robin Sears, who I had worked with in the federal NDP around several campaigns that I had worked on while I was at CUPE, heard that I wasn't happy at City Hall and that he knew that Ed Broadbent was looking for a new chief of staff. And on election night of 1980, Trudeau government was re-elected as a majority government. Broadbent called me and said, "Come to work for me." He said, "I've just come from a meeting with the Prime Minister, Trudeau, and he told me that he plans to repatriate the Constitution. And the British North America Act is going to be done, and Canada's going to have its own Constitution with its own Bill of Rights. And I, Ed, am going to play a major role in that." I said, "Why? Like, why should you play a major role?" And he said, "Because they don't have many seats in Western Canada. The Liberals just happen not to have members in Western Canada, and the British Parliament will not repatriate the Constitution without geographic representation throughout the country. And therefore, Ed needs our federal members in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and BC to support repatriation of the Constitution. So that's going to give me, Ed, a major role in the negotiations around repatriation. And because the key word is negotiations, I can't live without you." Not quite his words, but that's what he wanted me to believe. And since I was so desperate to get away from that bloody coffee pot in City Hall, I took my chances and said yes. the toughest thing to negotiate was actually part of what was the content of our Bill of Rights. Part of the negotiation between Broadbent and Trudeau was that in order to ultimately have NDP support for the repatriation motion, the NDP would have almost veto, not complete veto, on the Aboriginal and women's clauses in the Bill of Rights. The CBC came calling. That brought me into contact with Peter Herrendorf. He wanted me to come to work for him. I hemmed and hawed. My hemming and hawing was my lack of self-confidence, that I wasn't sure I could do the job. But also, I had just spent the last 30 months going from Ottawa at CUPE to Toronto, from Toronto back to Ottawa to work for Ed, and now I was going to go back to Toronto, and it seemed like a lot of bouncing around and a lot of tough for Mary Jane, who was just getting used to being a wife and being a mother. As much as I was dazzled by the job, I was genuinely reluctant to say yes. Peter, in the course of his trying to get me to say yes, invited himself to dinner. He said, "I hear your wife is really an excellent cook. I'm going to be in Ottawa, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you have me for dinner?" And so I did. And he came to dinner. We carried on the chat about the job. And then at the end of that dinner, Mary Jane volunteered to drive him to the Ottawa airport. And it still was undecided. Was I going to say yes or was I going to say no?
He was such an engaging person, and he cared so much about what other people thought. And he seemed interested. He was interested to meet me. That's why he wanted to come to dinner. He wanted to see Norm in his world. And when I came back, I said to Norm right away, "How can you not go to work for Peter?"
And from that moment on, it was clear that I was going to CBC. Very quickly, the boss-employee relationship turned into a much more collegial relationship, and that kindled a friendship that existed for those 40 years. The whole question of the worthwhileness of a public broadcaster has been on the Canadian agenda since the CBC was formed. There needs to be a place to tell the Canadian story. What is unique and special and needs to be preserved about Canadianism, justifying that, explaining to the Canadian public the validity of that, always an important part of CBC. The job had for me what seemed like all of the right components. It was public sector. It was an essential public service, public broadcast. It involved all kinds of opportunities as a communicator to be able to apply my skills and my learning to an environment that truly needed it. So when I think about my CBC time, when I think about accomplishments, it is that making the management work. A great kick of the CBC work for me was the relationship with so many super talented, creative people. Maureen O'Donnell was the head of publicity. It required us working closely together, and it evolved into a wonderful friendship. Our initial meeting didn't necessarily indicate that friendship would be so tight. Rather than a conversation about me or about her or about the work or about CBC, Maureen wanted to know how I felt about lace curtains. And would I allow her to have lace curtains in her office? And Maureen and I can still make each other giggle with the simple words, lace curtain. And in addition of the staff, Susan Jones, Greg Geddes, Denny Hamel, Eva Ziegler, John Hudecki, Seema Lerner, Ruth Ellen Souls, also blessed at CBC, became good friends. Peter Herrendorf, who was my boss, eventually had to leave CBC because Pierre Junot became the president and there was conflict with Peter, and so Peter decided to leave. Junot brought into CBC Thérèse Sevigny, who had been a fellow big-time capital L liberal in Quebec and national politics. She became my boss. When she did, despite what I was doing at CBC and despite my relationship with Peter, I really believed that my days were numbered, that the regime change that had brought Pierre Junot and her and others in would lead to my being evicted. And we never clicked. I always thought that she thought of me as a Brooklyn Jew who she couldn't identify with, and that I couldn't possibly identify with her as a Francophone woman. And maybe that was true. Maybe we couldn't. And then Thérèse showed up one day, and she burst into my office, and suddenly I wasn't this strange guy from Brooklyn. Norm, how you doing? Give me a big hug. Bonjour, ça va? Blah, blah, blah. You're still trying to speak French. I'm so glad you're doing that. You're trying so hard. Blah, blah, blah. What? I didn't know. And then, just as a matter of course, I met your wife. What? Oh, at the Ottawa airport. She chatted with me. She's a Francophone.
And it was just a brief encounter, really. But Norm always felt that completely shifted their relationship.
Thérèse was gone. I had been there 5-6 years. I figured as enough CBC, it's time to go to something else. And Hydro seemed public sector, a necessary public service, bigger issues, a lot more money to be spent. One thing led to another, and they offered me a job, and I was going to take it. And I gave Thérèse Sevigny's name as a reference. Hydro called Thérèse, and who knows what the conversation was. Thérèse called me, miffed beyond words. What do you mean? How could you do this to me? If you wanted to leave CBC, why didn't you come to New York with me? Gave her an honest answer because she didn't ask me. She said, oh, well, let's work it out. So we did. So instead of taking the Hydro job, I told Hydro no. Thanks for the offer, and I appreciate it, but I ain't coming. Thérèse Sevigny, first female undersecretary at the UN. And it was a fascinating gig. To that point, it was the Department of Public Information. It was only very neutral, straightforward. This is what the resolution the UN passed today said. None of, and therefore this is what you as a country should do. She wanted to turn it from public information to genuine communication, to strategic communication. So my role was to assess the existing staff and to figure out how it could be transformed into that kind of an organization. Here it was, at last, living the fantasy. Here I am where I belong. I was born to be a New Yorker, and I am a New Yorker. I was in New York. Mary Jane and Alana were at home in Toronto. Rand at that point was at university in Ottawa at Carleton. As Mary Jane and I were working out, okay, what's next? What are we going to do? I had the job at CBC to go back to. Because it was New York, I negotiated a leave of absence from CBC. And I was considering going back. And in fact, I was offered the job to replace Therese Sevigny as the national VP. It had frightened me because my French still wasn't what it ought to be to do that job. Totally good luck. Who do I bump into? Carl Lovis, the headhunter who had taken me to CBC, the headhunter who had tried to take me to Hydro. And I bump into him in an airport. "What's up, Norm?" "Oh, I'm just figuring out what to do after the UN." "Oh, you know they never filled the Hydro job. After you told them no, they just went with a temporary internal person who they're not happy with. They're still looking for someone. Are you interested?" 5 days later, I got a call from the CEO of Hydro with an offer to go to the Hydro job I had turned down a year earlier. And I did. So there I am, all of a sudden finding myself at Hydro, where I never expected to go. It was far more satisfying than even I had hoped it would be, because the content was invigorating for me. I still don't know why the light goes on when you throw the switch. I still don't know what makes electricity. But I understand the impact of the development of electricity and the production of electricity on the environment. I understand the impact of the hydro activity on the economy of the province. The major project was what was called the demand-supply plan. In the late 80s, it was determined that given the current rate of growth of industry and population in Ontario and the existing resources producing electricity, that we, Ontario, were headed for mega shortfalls, that in fact there was going to be major shortages of electricity. The company was developing what it called the demand-supply plan, which was how to manage electricity in the future. It wound up being a $6 billion project that needed to be sold to the electricity industry, to politicians, and to environmental stakeholders. And much of my time was spent organizing the products, everything from paid advertising to major publications. I have a great deal of pride in the fact that a case study on the demand-supply plan's communication and communication strategy became a Harvard Business School case study. In my early days at Ontario Hydro, I was walking through the maze of little cubbyholes that people worked in, and I walked by one of those cubbyholes, and there on the whiteboard was a kind of a definition of brand and what the Ontario Hydro brand meant and how to manage it. And I was attracted to the whiteboard because it fit with my view of all communication needing to be brand-driven. Turned out that whiteboard was written by John Botso. John and Grace became friends and baseball chums. The legitimate Hydro work and extracurricular Advertising Review Board, TVO, takes me to 95 and evolution into the telecom world. For the first time, being inside a private sector organization in a product competitive environment where doing a good job wasn't good enough, you had to do a winning job. If you lost the customer, it didn't matter how good everything else was if you didn't have the customer. I could begin to say with direct knowledge rather than a good guess that there is no truth to the statement that private sector manages itself much better than public sector. As much waste as you could point to in the public sector, and I'd say not much in most cases, you could sure find it inside Bell. When I started there, the idea of an internet service provider of internet was barely part of the business. The first major launch that I worked on was the launch of Simpatico as an internet service provider. It won't surprise you to hear that I didn't understand what internet was, let alone what an internet service provider was, but I was launching it. It was a fascinating project from a brand point of view, because the question was, how important was it that Bell was launching this? And as a result of the research and internal prejudices, there was one group of senior managers and marketers who believed that the internet service provider should not be Bell. That was part of the past, that it should be separate from Bell. And there was another group who believed that if you want people to have trust in this new product they didn't quite understand, who better than Ma Bell to be providing it? And only instinctively did I believe that it should be both. That yes, it was spiffy and new and different, but it had to have the Bell promise. So that became the strategy, and that became the challenge of all the creative work. It was Simpatico. Couldn't convince them to call it Bell Internet. They're sorry. They're sorry now it isn't Bell Internet. They're sorry that you've got to explain Simpatico to people. But if you look at the advertising for Simpatico, it's all yellow and blue. It's all part of the mother corporation. It's all in the same voice as the corporation. The Bell time was a fascinating, self-fulfilling experience for me. In early days at Bell Canada, I began to interact with Liz Siebert and Richard Beebe, both a couple in partnership in work and a married couple. Gradually, the work friendship grew into a broader friendship. Bell ended like it began. I was in with a regime change because the board had turned over the staff. And 3 years later, the board decided that the regime they had brought in 3 years earlier was deficient. Well, there I was, just having turned 55. We had a week in Florida. And in that week, I considered how lucky I was that I had looked after all of the hard stuff. And on the Sunday, I got a call from Peter Herrendorf. Peter, at that point, was still at TVO, but he was active in an organization called the Canadian Media and Television Production. And Peter asked me if I would be interested in rebranding the television fund. I had no idea what the television fund was, and I didn't have anything else to do on Monday, so I said yes, fully believing, could have passed the lie detector test, that I was helping out a chum. I had no idea that it was a gig. I had no idea that this was the beginning of Norman Simon Communicator Inc. And before long, I was dealing with the fund and its staff and figuring out how to reposition the organization, and then eventually how to give it a new look and a new form. And that led to pretty much 20 years of nonstop serving clients like that, mostly clients who came as a result of personal relationships, of people who I had either worked for, worked with, and what I didn't have to do, gladly, was to hustle work. So that luckily, the work just seemed to find its way to my doorstep. Wound up working in a lot of fascinating and interesting places. I was stunned regularly by the rewards, by the joy. It's actually a great source of pride to me that I was able to maintain my commitment to my point of view throughout. And in almost every case in my conventional jobs, the last conversation I had with a new employer was to tell that employer I don't intend to abandon my commitment to the workers and the work that's being done and to support those workers. I believe that when it comes to work, the difference between good work and great work is the quality of the relationship. People can do good work and hate each other. They can't do great work unless they respect each other. The Labor Day Parade had an importance in my life for 30 plus years after that. But I remember it first as a link to my father. It brought together much of our idealism. I guess for the first time, I understood how much he was a significant part of the labor movement in Canada, in the city and in Canada. He just was a part of everything, and involved with so many people who became known as giants of the labor movement. While I didn't understand the magnitude of what he was becoming when I was a little boy, or before I was born even, it certainly became part of my reality.
I don't think there's any question that I ended up in labor because of my grandfather. There's no debating that. I mean, my whole upbringing was hearing about unions and hearing about my grandfather helping to start or starting some of the very first unions in Canada and North America, organizing the garment workers, in Spadina, all that. And that was very interesting to me. My dad, of course, working at QP, later on working for the NDP and also doing elections through my youth, helping out, seeing them firsthand, going to Newfoundland for the provincial election, going to Winnipeg for the convention. So my upbringing was very much recognizing the value and importance of unions.
As a kid, I was recruited without choice to deliver leaflets during election campaigns. And pretty much for 60 years, I went to meetings and gave out leaflets. Almost every one of the workdays that happened was difficult and gnawing and tense and pressure-filled. One consistent that I relied on to make the days bearable. Are you ready for it? Baseball. My initiation to baseball was being taken to spring training in Tucson, where my mom misunderstood that a parade to welcome the Indians to Tucson was Aboriginals, Indians. Did I want to go and see the Indians? I said, sure. It turned out that the Indians were the Cleveland Indians. who were coming to Tucson for their spring training. But I became interested in baseball, and because of that interest, my Uncle Normie, who was also a big fan, started taking me to games. Continued through the Toronto Maple Leaf baseball team that happened to play in an old stadium at the foot of Bathurst Street that I used to go to. For $1, you could get a 50-cent ticket and buy 2 hot dogs and 2 Cokes. It became my refuge from reality. I was able to cope with all of the real-life tough stuff because I could hide behind the realities of what was happening in my baseball world that I could always forget by pulling down the baseball shade. That I could always close out the tension and the self-doubt and the lack of confidence and the difficulty of what was at hand by turning to baseball. We are a part of all that we have met, and I am a part of all that I have met. I believe that I have been bloody lucky and that I have met a lot of phenomenal people and met a lot of phenomenal circumstances.